Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to this obo-academy session. My name is Sabrina Toro, and I want to welcome you all and introduce our speaker for today. Our speaker is Harry Caulfield. He is a data scientist in Chris Mongo's group at the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory. He is fantastic. He is involved in so many projects that includes the Monarch Initiative, KG Hub, Bioportal, and of course, Bridge2AI, which Harry is going to tell us all about in a second. So thank you so much for being here, Harry. And thank you for taking the time to tell us all about Bridge2AI. And the floor is yours.
All right, thank you so much, Sabrina. And yeah, thanks to the obo-academy series for having me here to talk about Bridge2AI standards. Going to share my screen in just a moment. There we go. All right, and anybody, let me know if you can't see that properly. You should see the title slide. Excellent. So I'm going to talk a bit about the Bridge2AI Data Standards, and this is all in the context of what makes data AI ready. And I'm more specifically talking about biomedical and biological data, since that's what Bridge2AI is concerned with. But these are all kind of methods that we think can be applied to data sets more broadly, like many of the other tools in the obo toolbox. These are things that recognize that there's specific things in biomedicine and biology that we need to recognize. But yeah, many of these are resources that are more broadly applicable or defined for more general purpose needs. So okay, so what is Bridge2AI? So this is a large consortium project that's supported by the NIH, and specifically the Common Fund of the NIH, which is the part of the National Institutes of Health that are responsible for supporting essentially projects that don't really fit into one of the existing subgroups of the institute. These are the kind of projects that really need to bring together resources from a variety of different domains to solve a common problem. And in this case, that common problem is about how do we produce data that is ready for artificial intelligence driven methods in biomedicine. First of all, how do we actually generate data that we can reasonably say is ethically sourced, trustworthy, well-defined, and accessible? So this even kind of goes beyond the FAIR standards that you may already be familiar with in terms of, how do I actually get to the data? How do I find it? Those kind of things. This is actually about how the data was obtained and its intended purposes, and whether, once you can actually access it, whether, it's actually appropriate for a given use case. As part of this process, we realize that involves developing software and, importantly for this talk, standards to unify data attributes across potentially multiple or even a whole array of different data sources and data types. Now, I highlight standards as well because I'm in the standards working group. This consortium has a variety of different working groups focused on different aspects of what it is for data to be AI ready. And that working group in particular is focused on development and application of standards, as the name implies. So Bridge2AI is also concerned with creating automated systems and tools to accelerate the creation of, we do want data to be fair and ethically sourced, as we mentioned in that first bullet point. But in the process, that also means providing some resources that disseminate data and, kind of make our overall developed principles more clear, as well as the accompanying training materials and activities. So you can certainly find more detail on the links listed, and as usual, you'll have access to the slides after the talk. So why does this project really need data schemas? And I'm briefly going to be a little bit more specific in terms of schemas as kind of formalized representations of standards, because, well, we do have a lot of standards. And even before we start talking about standards, we recognize that the Bridge2AI consortium itself has these 4 data generating projects We have one called Voice, that's essentially using recordings of people's voice as a way to determine health status or disease status, which is really pretty neat stuff. One called AI Ready, that's a bit more focused on diabetes, but also broader concerns. One called Chorus, again, focused on a variety of different properties of clinical data, and then one called CM4AI, and that's one of more of our molecular biology focused groups that's focused on identifying the specific placement of proteins and protein complexes within cells themselves. So you can imagine that there's a variety of different multifaceted data coming out of these data generating projects, and they're all respecting potentially different data standards. In some cases, maybe somewhat immature or less developed data standards. And those data standards exist within an entire ecosystem. And in this case, I'm going to define standards fairly broadly to include not just formalized standards, but also more generally defined standards, file formats, uh, existing data resources in a way are standards because they define the kinds of existing data that's already available. Controlled vocabularies and ontologies certainly are forms of standards because they define the relationships between things, or even just the terminology used to refer to them. Or even just reference implementations of standards are in a way standards in themselves. So I've chosen to use this very broad definition in lieu of trying to say, this is what a standard is, and if you're not using this, you are not a standard, or you're not producing standardized data, because that's ends up being somewhat counterproductive. In that process, we do also know that we want to incorporate the different types of topics that a particular data set may cover, or the different types that are present, and its relevant use cases and its metadata. So all this really comes back to the question of, okay, what are we trying to do with all this data and metadata, and why do we want it in nicely formatted formal schemas? So even without real world data, how do we structure these links between standards and use cases? If we say, okay, well, this is what data is good for, and we need to be following a certain standard, how do we formalize that connection? And then once we do have the data, how do we link those use cases back to the data and say, okay, well, this data set has parts A, B, and C. This use case needs to have parts B, C, and D. So you can't quite do this use case, but if you provide that additional missing piece, then you may be able to accomplish it. How do we actually formalize that? Especially in cases where, well, yeah, our data is very multifaceted. And how about those cases where the standards don't exist yet or quite immature? For things like audio data, well, we have great standards for defining, like the format, or say like the bit rate of the audio, even details like, okay, this was the exact equipment that it was recorded with. But when you start talking about things like, okay, this is the distance between the recording device and the human face, well, there may not be existing standards to formalize that, except, well, that turns out that's actually one of the critical details for determining whether your data is usable or not, or whether it's consistent. Just to summarize that a bit, we'd like to think that at least standards are formally defined. They're computable. We'd like them to be computable, or at least machine readable. We'd like them to be actionable. That is, we'd like to be able to use them to validate against some kind of, we want to be able to validate data against a given standard, even in a manual way, if absolutely necessary. And we would also like them to be freely accessible. That's just generally true, is that we want things to be accessible. It is also an added bonus to have a nice thriving user community and abundant use cases. Again, these are all things that are really nice to have, but in practice, we don't necessarily see. We know many standards may be defined rather abstractly, especially in the clinical domain. Many of them are just defined in free text. You may have had a position paper put out one time that said, okay, we are experts in this field. We think these should be the standards in this area. Let's write them out in text. Okay, we're done. And in many ways, that's perfectly fine because, well, you're working with data sets that will be validated by people. they'll be validated by the data producers. And sometimes if you give them at least a checklist, then they can do that in a slightly more formalized way. But often those checklists themselves are more written for human readability than for machine readability. For example, if you look at like the ARRIVE standards for reporting of in vivo animal experiments, or the CARE guidelines for publishing case reports, those have checklists available, so you can go through and say, okay, well, my data or my final reporting of this data meet these guidelines, and therefore they meet standard, but they're not necessarily things that you can define in a computable way. Many other standards are intentionally minimally defined. For example, it's been increasingly common to see clinical observations reported according to the HL7 FIRE standard, which is very well developed. At this point, it has an excellent community of people who are actively improving it very regularly. But by its definition, it is not supposed to be comprehensive. It is not supposed to define every potential aspect of clinical data. So if you have a clinical study where you're trying to do something that's not currently covered in that FIRE standard, well, you may have to build on standard a little bit. So standards like this, luckily, are modular by design, and they have standard operating procedures for building on them. And people do, in fact, build on them pretty regularly, but they're not necessarily ready to go. Again, if you have a very novel study that you're trying to do, that standard may not already capture what you are trying to describe. And lastly, some of these standards are just plain closed or require payment to access. In the clinical domain, that may mean clinical coding systems besides the ICD standard, which is kind of pseudo open depending upon which version you're using. Or specifically for projects like that voice project, if you're looking at the kind of the developed industrial standards for things that you may want to measure in human bioacoustics, there is a standard out there, but you got to pay to access it. It's not like freely reproducible or exchangeable. So luckily, this isn't a massive problem for most biomedical or biological standards, as there is a culture of openness. But yeah, for really rigorously defined standards, they may not be as accessible as we might like. So as a result, well, it's challenging to automate data validation against established standards for a variety of reasons, but at most because, well, they're just not computable. So given this issue, the first thing I can say is, well, hey, better documentation always helps. It won't necessarily make that data more computable or more machine readable, but it does point it in the right direction. It does allow us to say, hey, this data is in this format. It is, it is at least attempting to follow this given set of standards. It even just basic details like who created it or what data license it's released under go a long way. And I'll get to a bit later in this talk about how we can actually deal with extracting those details. But for now, I'll just ask the question of, okay, how do we evaluate whether a given data set is appropriate for AI-driven analysis? In brief, how can we determine whether it is literally AI ready? And of course, there's a lot more that goes into that question that I won't even be getting into right now. But instead, I will try to answer it with two options. And I will spoil these by saying, yes, we are attempting to do both of these options. The first of which is, okay, well, let's structure the standards better so we can better determine which are most appropriate for a given data set and a given use case. This doesn't mean structuring individual standards. This means essentially structuring their metadata, or in some cases, just getting a better idea about what their intended use cases or domains are. Our second option here is to, okay, well, let's focus on the data sets. We can structure the data set metadata better, so we can more easily determine and evaluate, what's actually in that data. We can extract the details like, okay, what license is it released under, things like that. But we can also go into a bit more detail and say like, okay, well, this data set has 5 parts, and each of them is a TSV, and they follow this particular format. These are all the kind of things that we'd love to have detailed documentation for, but just often don't for for whatever reason. So again, we're going to try to do both. Now, I'm going to take a short detour into the specific challenges that we're trying to deal with in recognizing whether data is AI ready or not. I said I wasn't going to comprehensively define it, but I think it's important to understand some of the critical differences that we have when we're talking about AI ready data versus just our traditional FAIR data, or even kind of the more technical understanding of like, okay, I can use this data for data analysis now. It's cleaned. It's very clear what its applications are. And I think some of these were best summarized in this paper that I've cited down here on the bottom by Hunter and Holmes in New England Journal of Medicine. So I'll focus on a couple of details here. One is just that top detail that, one of the main differences here is just that when you are dealing with artificial intelligence methods, you may not actually have very specific prior hypotheses. And that is just the nature of the kind of approach. Sometimes these are characterized more as fishing expeditions, and I don't think that's entirely fair. But we should compare them to the more traditional approach of, okay, I have a specific prior hypothesis. I may be doing an exploratory study, but when it comes down to it, I have something that I may be trying to overturn through a statistical analysis that will show whether or not I can overturn it. Part of the strength of artificial intelligence is that it's capable of observing these latent relationships. There we go. Thank you. One other thing that I will also focus on here is the difference in the applications of AI-driven methods. Here they mention that, well, okay, in many cases we're dealing with not just these massive data sets, what at one time we may have called big data, from the entirety of electronic health records, or from unstructured data that we're going to do natural language processing on. In many cases, it's not necessarily the size of data as much as the level of resolution that we're trying to deal with it in. For example, here they mention analysis of images or outputs from monitors. In many cases, we just want to analyze that at a very high resolution and also integrate it with our other data sources. When we're dealing with these conventional statistical methods, that's often just not statistically possible or even realistic. If we want to be able to arrange something in a tabular data, that's fine if we have maybe a small subset of factors or potential predictors that we're dealing with. But when we're dealing with vectors and multiple tensors of vectors of thousands of potential predictors, and especially when they're very sparse, that is, there's a lot of zeros inherent in our observations. Well, often those statistical methods just do not work, or when they do work, when they need to be applied very carefully. Not to say that the artificial intelligence methods do not need to be applied carefully, but there's often a lot of additional considerations that we need to put into those multifaceted, multi-data type kind of analyses. So another approach is one from this study in Nature Medicine by Aurora et al. Again, this is last year. And while they were generally focused on, okay, we do need to apply standards in health data sets, they put additional focus on the idea that one of the primary needs for applying standards in health data just comes from the fact that, well, it's necessary if we want to be able to achieve our goals of having more diverse studies that are better representative of the actual populations that they're supposed to be applied to. So here on the left of this figure, they're essentially just showing, well, often if we're just sampling from a given set of data, well, the traditional approach is if we don't have data that fits our given population, often it's either excluded or it's included. But there's potential differences in those data points that make them look like outliers simply just because they're not as well represented compared to the majority set. Or there really is something that's of note there that we're just essentially gonna miss because it's not actually representative of a given population. So really our goal is, okay, well, we do want some kind of regular representation of our overall population that essentially would be very similar to what we'd want to apply our eventual method or our model to. So how do we actually get that? I mean, the very easy answer is to say, okay, well, we need standards for sampling from a given population. And the community generally admits, okay, yeah, this is great. We do want to be able to enable rapid identification of risks and harms. That's a thing that standards can help with. We want to be able to have better data sets that, where we can better address potential sources of bias and provide accountability. All absolutely fantastic goals. But at the same time, there's a contingent of people who realize, okay, well, sometimes that isn't as simple as just saying, okay, well, we need X number of people from Y group in our data set. Sometimes that means, okay, well, you find, well, a product or, maybe an approach or a model that might actually fairly work well for a particular population, sorry about that. It might actually be withdrawn because, well, we didn't test it on enough of this other group. Uh, or in some cases, the broader worry is more that, well, it kind of might push towards unethical data gathering practices where you're saying, hey, you're a member of this group, you need to participate in the study, we're really going to push you to participate in this study. Or even just cases of what's sometimes referred to as like research tourism, where there's very little recognition of the benefits to a particular research group subpopulation. And you're really just saying, hey, you're contributing to the study, and maybe down the road you'll benefit in kind of an indirect way. It's really critical in a lot of these research efforts to recognize the kind of impacts that you'd have on a subpopulation, even at the time of collecting the initial data, and even as the research study continues. So standards are not a silver bullet. They're not going to solve all these problems, but they're probably better than not having any standards at all. And I think everyone in this room can agree on that. So what does Bridge2AI need to actually represent? In the most general sense, we're focused on three kinds of things: standards, the concepts related to those standards, and the actual data sets themselves. That is, in this case, the data sets that are coming out of our data generating projects. So this is just a figure from the initial proposal for our standards group. And you'll see front and center in this figure is LinkML. And you're going to hear quite a bit about LinkML in subsequent slides, unsurprisingly, because it's essentially the primary way in which we are defining our schemas in these projects. And on the left, we're essentially just trying to convey that, well, we have a variety of different data sets that come in different formats. They're produced using different tools. They contain different but sometimes overlapping kinds of phenomena. And when it comes down to it, our eventual goals are, well, we do want to be able to validate these data sets against a given schema with a standard operating procedure. But in some ways, we also want to be able to transform our data and the schemas themselves in ways that both other projects can better plug into their own pipelines, but are also kind of future-proofed in a way where we can say, okay, well, maybe in the future, there are AI methods that really want rigorously defined schema that need to be in JSON format for whatever reason. Well, LinkML is perfectly capable of doing that and a variety of other things. So if we narrow that down a little bit more, we can narrow down our types of data. And in this context, we're not talking about the data that is being produced by the projects, but by the data in our schema. So we're looking at things like individual standards and the tools used with them. We're looking at use cases, and we're looking at experimental observations. That is the actual biological or the biomedical data in our context. And I see a context from Nico that I'm not going to get to right now, but I will get to shortly. So as for our actual schemas, the bulk of this is actually going to be representing those standards and the tools with a class appropriately called data standard or tool. In turn, we keep track of the organizations that are responsible for those data standards or tools, their relevant data topics, and their data substrates. That is the actual form of the data. As for the use cases themselves, well, they have their own, essentially their own schema. The experimental observations are one of those kind of areas where we need to be able to link them to the use cases and through that to the data standards or tools. But the actual form that they take in the end is largely up to the data generating projects. And that's from the beginning, we knew that we weren't going to be enforcers. We weren't going to be going into this consortium saying everyone needs to follow these exact standards, largely because much of the research effort in the consortium didn't happen in a timeline that would allow us to say that, which I mean, in some ways is both a feature and a bug. It means that we really do have to listen to and work with the DGPs to know exactly why they choose a given standard or why they're trying to build on existing ones in certain ways. But also means that they work with us to determine kind of the best path forward for the consortium as well. So what we ended up with for now is a Bridge2AI standards registry. Again, this is all LinkML data. So the source of truth is in a GitHub repository. The files listed here are essentially the data sets. Most of that, as I said, is in the data standards or tools. There is a temporary front end that's available, but one of our main goals here is just to really get a much more user-friendly visualization off the ground. And we have some prototype versions that we're unfortunately not quite ready to share yet, but those are in the works, along with some great help from folks at Sage Bionetworks that have experience doing this with some other projects. So I'm confident that sometime early this year we'll see some much nicer representations of these. But for now, if you're not afraid to read YAML or somewhat disorganized tables, well, then you're all set. The Nico has another question that I will not get to just yet. This isn't going to take the whole hour, so we'll have plenty of time for discussion at the end. So I'm going to go through some quick examples of these just to give you an idea of the kind of data that we're working with. This is in lieu of walking through the entire data standards schema. But in the case of, for example, a data standard or a tool, we're keeping track of some of the basics, like, okay, well, here's our name and description. We have essentially kind of a tagging system that tracks which kind of a collection each of these standards are in. But we also keep track of things like, okay, well, this is the particular data topic that this relates to. Here's a short description of its purpose. We keep track of whether it's open in the sense of kind of fairly open. We keep track of whether it requires registration, because sometimes a standard does require you to provide a name and email, whether it's free of payment or not. And then there's other linking details like, okay, well, here's the URL, but also here's a link to the formal specification if one such exists. And for whatever reason, this one got mangled a little bit. I'm not sure what's up with that. As well as the contribution metadata as well. So in this case, that's me. Now, we do also keep track of the data substrate. In this case, we define that as what the actual form of the data here is. For example, here we've defined an array. So you can imagine that this can get very abstract, but we realized early on that this is a really critical detail if we're trying to compare different data sets to say, okay, well, this is a data set with a given name. Here's what it says it contains, but the actual form is in an array. Or in this case, we could also say, okay, well, it's also in an associative array, which is a subclass of that initial array class. Now we've conflated, in some ways, we've conflated data formats. So if you look elsewhere in data substrates, you'll find things like XML or JSON. Really just as a way to say, okay, well, here are what the kind of the technical details are here. In many ways, we're following some of the trends by projects like EDM, where they have defined data types. In the case of EDM, largely in the context of formats. But we recognized again that we really do want to be able to keep track of this level of detail for a data set, so we can know right away, like, okay, well, is our use case actually going to be able to work with this data, or is it actually in a completely unexpected kind of format? If we were expecting it to be an array and it's actually, just kind of like loose text, well, we know we're going to have some problems. The flip side of that is data topic. So here we formally define that as, okay, what's the actual domain of the data? For example, is it data about biology? Is it data about cell level data? And of course, one given data set may cover a variety of different topics. And so in LinkML, that's fairly simple to model that. And again, we've also cross-linked these data topics to things like EDM IDs, where we have previous efforts to recognize that, yes, there are a variety of different topics in biology or even broader science, and they do have a hierarchical relationship in many cases. So you can probably see right away that the way that we've expressed data substrates and data topics is in a way kind of an ontology in itself, where I'm looking at these as kind of a pseudo ontology in the sense that they're doing a lot of the same kinds of things that other hierarchical relationships have done to try to at least somewhat comprehensively understand the kind of things that make a data set what it is, and the kind of things it may be useful for. So I think it's probably going to take more effort than it's worth to make them completely comprehensive, but at least we have something that's more appropriate for our needs than any single existing ontology was capable of representing. By that same token, we're also representing organizations. Again, this is never going to be comprehensive, and we're relying on resources like Wikidata or the ROR to provide external identifiers for organizations, but it's also something that we keep track of, especially when we're trying to ask questions like, okay, who's actually responsible for this data? Who created it? Who should we address with further questions in the future? And then finally, we have our use cases. So in this case, we're trying to answer the question of, okay, what do we actually do with data, and what prerequisites exist? This is really where a lot of the other schemas come together. For example, here we have a very straightforward, simple use case of, okay, what if our use case is just to obtain patient data from the records of clinical visits? We recognize that this is something where at least 3 out of the 4 of our data generating projects are actively doing this. So we can mention that here, but we also recognize, hey, there's 2 specific data topics this is relevant to. There's 2 specific standards and tools that we know are directly applicable to this, and then there are subsequent use cases that this is a prerequisite for, that this enables. So I'd like to believe there's a variety of different ways that we can model this, but thus far I am not aware of any other system out there that models the relationships between use cases and the specific standards that you need to apply to actually get them done. So on kind of more of a technical note, I'm kind of proud of this, and this is actually code that was inspired by Charlie Hoyt's work with, I think, probably bioregistry to implement. But there's a system where if you submit a GitHub issue to the registry proposing a new standard, then it automatically parses it and uses it to assemble a new PR. So it just adds it to the appropriate part of the registry, and it usually needs a little bit of human attention before it's ready to go. But at least it automates much of the process already, so it makes it far easier to add new standards to them without, breaking the entire data set. So as for the schemas themselves, those are also freely available online at the accompanying link. They're lightly documented. And since we just went through the examples, I'm not going to go through a whole lot of the details of the schemas themselves. But what I will do is mention that this is an instance where we've made the choice to represent this as really a set of schemas that are all kind of loaded together through LinkML. This is a bit unorthodox if you're familiar with things like BioLink, where essentially the entirety of the schema is in one place, and that certainly solves some technical concerns. But one decision that we made early was that we wanted to encourage modularity. We wanted to be able to look at things like the data substrate schema and say, okay, well, this actually does have use in its own right. It's entirely feasible that you may want to just have a set of data substrates or a set of data topics, and you're actually not really concerned about what defines a data standard or what defines an organization. In many cases, those are in fact covered by other schemas. So we want to make this a bit more modular, and that's what gets it done, at least through the LinkML paradigm. So just to reiterate what I think is quite unique about these Bridge2AI resources so far, and I'll mention now that these are all constantly in development and being improved. But even so far, I think these are a pretty decent representation of open schema, accompanied by data and a set of ontology-like concepts. And I don't think you find anything else like this out there, at least nothing that's going to fit Bridge2AI needs. These are readily expandable and transformable thanks to the power of LinkML. And as LinkML continues to add improvements to things like validation functions, well, these schemas and their dependent resources benefit from those improvements as well. I think it's really great at representing abstract concepts, again, inspired by resources like EDM, and to some degree that your more somewhat ontology-like resources like NCIT or the broader UMLS vocabulary. But again, in this case, this is adapted for the specific use cases, both literally and quite figuratively, since we are representing use cases as well. And it's something that you're not going to see quite as much in things like EDM or even in NCIT, because they're a bit more complex to define. And then, yeah, so that's what I think are kind of the primary strengths of the schema. So I'll switch gears a moment. And before we switch gears, I think I have some time to address some of Nico's comments. So Nico mentions for that previous point on one of those slides, he mentions if you feed information that's biased in some unfair way to an LLM learning process, it or the application on top of the LLM, like ChatGPT, will behave potentially unethical as well. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, interesting to subsume this concern under AI ready. Yeah, and that's actually kind of, I think, one strength of the kind of the consortium from the beginning is that they've really been concerned about ethics in data collection, and not just about kind of application. I think a lot of the more kind of obvious borderline ethical applications certainly take a come to the forefront, but yeah, certainly the biases that are present in your initial model development, yeah, will absolutely show up later. And I think we've even been seeing that with much of the applications of current language models now, where it's the only way you can really kind of, well, you can never avoid the bias entirely, but it's become abundantly clear that many of these models are developed in kind of a plausible deniability kind of paradigm where there's not a full knowledge of how the data was collected, so the model, the people responsible for the model just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, how do we don't know if it's ethical or not. Okay, and yes, and Nico says his second question was answered there, so fantastic. Okay, so I mentioned a bit about focusing on data metadata as well, and that's certainly of utmost concern in Bridge2AI. And one idea that we had fairly early on, and this is the kind of thing that's been percolating about in NIH circles for a while as well, is this concept of data sheets for data sets. So if you're not familiar with this paper by Gebru et al., the preprints online, they've been developing it for years. I think the most recent version is from 2021. And I'm not going to read all the text here, but I do encourage you to go read that, because essentially it breaks down a process of essentially formalizing the kind of data about data that you might want to accompany your data set with as you produce it, and especially as you release it to the public. So in this they mentioned that they're trying to address both the needs of the dataset creators and people consuming it. In some cases, many of these concerns are more about the people consuming the data, because without proper documentation, well, you just may not find it to be usable. And it certainly isn't going to be AI ready if you can't even tell what is in the data, or even details about, like, its potential risks or harms of applying those data sets, or even, whether it's appropriate for your needs or your use cases. Now, an important detail in this is that they wrote this entire set of data sheets for data sets, essentially as a checklist or a series of things that you may want to concern yourself with as a human data creator. And they do very explicitly emphasize that this process is not intended to be automated. So of course, my immediate question is, what if we did automate it? And maybe not the whole thing. Obviously, there's many aspects of creating or applying a data set that, yeah, even at this time are still best left to human researchers. But in many ways, I think we can automate part of that process to ensure that, we actually get better metadata, that it's more informative and more consistently structured, and hence itself more AI ready. So, for example, if we look at this is another paper in arXiv that actually is a really good example of a data sheet, in this case for the CheckSpurt data set, which is about X-ray images of the chest. And hey, they go right through this data sheets checklist, and they answer in quite extensive detail about format and content of the data and how they derived it and how they pre-processed it, and where to find it. So this ends up being a really great example. The only downside is, okay, well, it's largely free text. Not a problem if you're a human reader. And at the same time, we also have, kind of the more slightly more formalized representations of data sets on sites like Hugging Face, which do in fact support something very much like data sheets. The problem in that sense is, well, most people don't necessarily take advantage of that functionality as much as they could. It ends up being treated a bit more like a README on a GitHub repository, where sometimes it's really just kind of the bare bones details and doesn't necessarily flesh out as much as you might in a full paper. But in many cases, they do link to more informative documents. So that's kind of our first question there is, can we extract metadata from both this kind of document and from the linked documents like websites or manuscripts? So that's why we developed the data sheets for data sets. In this case, we're going to call it the D4D schema. Yes, this is another LinkML schema, so it gets all the benefits of LinkML. It is available online. I've been developing this along with Marcin and Justin from our group here at LBNL, aiming it for two primary use cases. The first of which would be to drive a manual survey for data creators, where essentially you'd be presented with a series of questions, and then you'd fill them in. After the fact, if you had a question, a response that could be linked back to a consistent identifier, well, that's exactly what their survey would do. Now, that naturally leads into the more automated approach driven by something like OntoGPT with the Spires method, which attempts to extract questions based on a schema, or rather the answers to the questions based on a schema, and then align them with consistent IDs. Now, I'm not going to show the entire schema. That's all on GitHub, but I will show that there's specific subsets based on the original data sheets for data sets paper, that we essentially try to break our different classes up to. Each class in the schema is more or less representative of an individual question, or at least kind of a subset of that question. We've also borrowed quite a bit from the basic LinkML data types schema that's kind of a built-in, and we've built on that to make sure that everything is actually used consistently. But kind of the main focus areas here are the motivation for creating the data set, the composition of the data set, that is what's actually in there, and we'll be able to answer your question about, like, okay, is it appropriate for me to use this data set? The details of collection, that is what actually went into collecting it, especially details about the subpopulations that were involved. Anything that was done to pre-process, clean, or label the data. The actual intended use cases, so you can see right away how this is very clearly related to our use cases. Distribution of the data, that is, how to actually get it, and whether you're allowed to redistribute it. and the ongoing maintenance of the data, if any, that is, who's responsible for that. So I alluded to the fact that we can just take this schema and plug that into OntoGPT. And well, with some short modifications, mostly in terms of adjusting the data types, well, thus far we can. And in fact, I think some of this may not be live on the existing version, but imminently it will be. So you can feel free to try this with OntoGPT yourself. But let's say we point it at one of those Hugging Face data set pages. Can we actually extract some metadata from that? And long story short, yes, we can. It's not always as consistent as we might like, again, because, well, the documentation itself isn't always consistent as we might like, but at least in many cases, we can extract things like the exact type of license it was released under. We can extract keywords and the language that it's in, and certainly more obvious things like the title or the ID. So not terribly complex, but in many cases, doing a automated extraction on this is far superior to going through and doing it manually. So especially if you, say, have a variety of data sets that you're considering for use in an AI method, well, certainly this is viable for at least getting kind of a snapshot of what each contains. And again, there's not currently a way to do this otherwise, other than filtering your Hugging Face search, but even that isn't necessarily set up for things like biomedicine. So I alluded to GitHub repositories instead, and well, we can also point this at GitHub repo README. In this case, I pointed at the craft NLP corpus. And well, unfortunately, this was kind of an underwhelming result, where in this case, instead of extracting a license, it extracted a link that said view license. So still a couple kinks in this method that we're trying to work out, but at least, hey, it extracted the version. So that's one detail that we want to be able to get. In this case, I pointed at a different GitHub repository, and well, it did get the license that time, so that's a plus. And it also extracted some useful keywords, even if they're formatted in kind of a slightly funny way. So getting more consistent formatting for some of this is probably going to be a critical detail before we begin to link it to things like broader ontology. And in fact, if we're looking at things like keywords, there's even some possibility that we can link it back to that Bridge2AI standard schema, which is kind of an overarching goal. Now, of course, the immediate next step is, okay, well, why not just point it at things like papers or the data portal documentation, because they're much more detailed. They actually do answer the question directly of, what actually went into this data set. And additionally, we know that they're created to be the documentation for that data, rather than documentation for a repository or documentation for some kind of external website that maybe people aren't confident is going to be the reference that people are going to use for documentation. So in this case, if we point it at just the what is Reactome page for the Reactome pathway resource, it turns out we actually do get some pretty nice structured metadata. Right away, it extracts things like, okay, who are the people involved here? What tasks is appropriate for? What are the external resources that this links to? Including things like, okay, what are distribution formats? And the vast majority of these things are already defined in unstructured text, but here we have them in a much more formalized format that, again, we can link back to other ID spaces and resources as needed. Now, annoyingly, this did extract the license and use terms as license agreement because it just found the link and didn't immediately realize that is not a valid license. So this is one area where a more rigorous OntoGPT style approach, where we ensure that things are linked to a consistent set of IDs, may be appropriate. So that's in the works. So if you'd like to learn more about any of these resources, they are all on GitHub, as is the documentation. In the case of Bridge2AI, there is a public-facing bridge2ai.org site where you can learn more about the consortium and its efforts. And certainly all of these schemas in the registry itself are available online as well, as am I. So with that, I'd be happy to take any further questions. I'd certainly like to thank everybody in the LBNL group, as well as the Bridge2AI Standards Working Group. There are far too many people in the consortium than I will ever be able to thank, despite their valuable contributions. So I just want to admit that from the outset, and also mention, yeah, that this is all supported by a specific funding through NIH for the Bridge2AI Standards core. So yeah, happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Harry. That was a fantastic presentation. I do have a question, but first I want to let anybody please unmute and ask any questions to Harry. We have about 8 minutes, so
Yeah, Nico, I'll just rephrase your question there. Yeah, he admits that it's an annoying question, but does have to be asked. No, that's fine. If there's ever attempts to align with the existing dataset standards like DCAT or the provenance standard, there aren't any explicit efforts right now. I think in terms of the D4D schema, I think there's definitely a lot of space where we can directly align with those, even just as recognizing, kind of the equivalent elements of the data model that we're recognizing. In the broader standard schema, I think to some degree it'll have to depend on the needs of the broader consortium. There's definitely some instances where we've gone in saying, hey, we're really excited about adding this to our schema, and then it's if the DGPs don't really care about it much, then it's not necessarily going to get a whole lot of traction. I personally would love to see those incorporated as well, because further alignment with the existing standards is really supposed to be one of the central tenets of the consortium. So I'd love to see that happen.
thank you, Harry. I'm just going to ask my question now. So and I think everybody here on this, the participants here, we are a lot of biocurators and ontologists, and so we already have the data, or the data is in whatever form. So what, in your opinion, what can we do to be part of the solution and to help getting the data AI ready? So I think one of the things you mentioned is having good documentation. So my question here is, what should we add to the documentation to make sure that it's helpful, and we can push this? And if this second question, is there something else than documentations that we could do that would help?
Oh yeah, no, I think that's a fantastic question. And I think some of the kind of the low-hanging fruit in documentation is often just kind of including the additional human element. Like I think it's really great that at least in biocuration and even increasingly in the broader biodata community, adding provenance details like, hey, just who edited this last? Can we provide an ORC ID? Can we ensure that we're tracking the creator of this data set or this particular row? And I think that's crucial as we go on, especially in the life cycle of any one of these data sets, and realize, hey, we actually do need to get in contact with these people and kind of ask, like, why is this set up the way it was? Because this other biocurator has been just following that pattern for the last 3 years. So I think that provenance data is probably often the low-hanging fruit, because it probably takes the least amount of effort to actually incorporate. But maybe even in a broader sense, kind of broader data set provenance as well, just kind of consistent annotation of where individual elements are coming from, whether it's in a given ontology, which I think in general are really great about mentioning things like, okay, well, this definition of this term actually came from this this source. In some cases, that's not quite as consistently annotated, and I think that can really go a long ways. And maybe that's an area where things like SYSM can help, because you really are specifically formalizing that relationship between different, at least between different namespaces and different concepts, especially in cases where they don't necessarily completely align, but you still want to be able to recognize, okay, well, this is actually a pretty close match for this other concept, and that's yeah, a pretty important detail both in documentation and in kind of a broader data set integration. I'm sorry, I'm trying to recall what the second half of that that question was, Sabrina.
That is fantastic answers. The other part of the question was, is there something in addition to documentation that we could do to help? And I really, really like the fact that you're focusing on the low-hanging fruits, because we all know we're all busy. We don't have a lot of time and we don't have a lot of things we can change. So yeah, is there something else that it's easy for us to do to help?
Yeah, and that's kind of the philosophy that I've had so far about extracting metadata on things, is that there's definitely a subset of tasks that nobody really wants to have to do. Maybe it just kind of feels like busy work. Maybe it's because we're not necessarily aware of what the existing standards are. So the more friction we can take out of these processes, the better. I think some of it's kind of the more the day-to-day, like data processing, data cleaning kind of tasks. Some of it's more data transformation that you don't want to have to do it in a manual way, but many times there's kind of bespoke processes for doing data parsing or transformation that we would be much better handled by kind of centralized, consistent processes. Even just for determining provenance and saying like, hey, at some point along the line, this data set existed in this one form. We know it got transformed to another form. So how did it actually happen? And yeah, sometimes that can be handled with documentation. Sometimes it can be handled with the process itself. I mean, obviously that's something that LinkML is focused on a lot. But in the broader sense, as long as there is just consistent process for doing data transformations, then yeah, I think that really it takes a lot of the friction out of the equation. And it turns it from something that from an additional task that somebody has to worry about into just something that it just happens on its own. It's just part of the data pipeline. And the more process that I think we can set up like that, the more we can focus on kind of the more critical details, like where did this actually come from? What are we actually going to use this for? So yeah, I think kind of abstract, but yeah, I think that's that's kind of the way I've been thinking about it lately. Is just make as many of these processes just as foolproof as possible. Maybe a bit of the opposite of the philosophy that the data set for data sheets folks had of like, okay, you need to be introspective about your data. It's like, yeah, you do need to do that, but you have a limit to the amount of time you can spend on introspection.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're at the top of the hour, so thank you again, Harry. If there's any more questions for Harry, please reach out. All his information is here on the slide. Also, we have a Slack channel. The next obo-academy session will be on February 6th. Seth Carbon will tell us all about open source licenses. So it's going to be yet another very interesting conversation and information. So thank you for being here. Thank you for joining, and enjoy the rest of your day. And we'll see you next time. Bye.